Chapter 18. Story and game structures can be artfully merged with indirect control. In late 1966, musician John Lennon was invited to attend an art exhibition called Unfinished Paintings and Objects at the Indica Gallery in London. He had no special interest in avant-garde art and had never heard of the artist, a woman named Yoko Ono, but when he arrived, one particular piece caught his attention: a tall stepladder in the center of the room. Mounted above it on the ceiling was a white canvas that appeared to be blank. Above the ladder, beside the ceiling-mounted canvas, hung a magnifying glass on a chain. John eyed this weird assemblage uncertainly. Was he just supposed to look up at it? The painting looked blank, but if it was, why was the magnifier up there? He bolstered his courage, climbed the wobbly ladder, and precariously balancing on the top step, picked up the magnifier and craned his neck to look up at the white canvas. At first, he thought it was blank, some kind of artistic statement about nothingness. But then he saw it, one tiny word impossible to read without the glass, which would change his life forever. The word was yes. The feeling of freedom. In previous chapters, we touched on the conflict between story and gameplay. At its heart, this is a conflict about freedom. The wonderful thing about games and interactive experiences is the freedom that the player feels. This freedom gives the player the wonderful feeling of control and makes it easy for them to project their imaginations into the world you have created. The feeling of freedom is so important in a game that it merits a new lens. Number 79, the lens of freedom. A feeling of freedom is one of the things that separates games from other forms of entertainment. To make sure your players feel as free as possible, ask yourself these questions. When do my players have freedom of action? Do they feel free at these times? When are they constrained? Do they feel constrained at these times? Are there any places I can let them feel freer than they do now? And are there any places where they are overwhelmed by too much freedom? And even though it makes it very difficult for us to control the interest curve for the player, when we give them these wonderful feelings of interactivity and control, we have to give them freedom, right? Wrong. We don't always have to give the player true freedom. We only have to give the player the feeling of freedom. For, as we've discussed, all that's real is what you feel. If a clever designer can make a player feel free, when really the player has very few choices or even no choice at all, then suddenly we have the best of both worlds. The player has the wonderful feeling of freedom, and the designer has managed to economically create an experience with an ideal interest curve and an ideal set of events. But how is such a thing possible? How can one create the feeling of freedom when no freedom or very limited freedom exists? After all, a designer has no control over what a player does when they enter a game, right? No, not right. It is true that the designer does not have direct control over what a player does, but through various subtle means, they can exert indirect control over the actions of a player. And this indirect control is possibly the most subtle, delicate, artful, and important technique of any we will encounter. To understand what I'm talking about, let's look at some of the methods of indirect control. There are many of them, varied and subtle, but generally these 6 do most of the work. Indirect control method number 1, constraints. Consider the difference between these 2 requests. Request 1, pick a color. Request 2, pick a color, A, red, B, blue, C, green. Both of them give the answerer freedom of choice, and they are both asking for about the same thing. But the difference is tremendous because, for request 1, the answerer could have chosen one of millions of different answers. Fire engine red, cauliflower blue, mauvish top, sky blue pink. No, you pick a color. Or just about anything, really. But for request 2, the answer only has 3 choices. They still have freedom. They still get to choose. But we have managed to cut the number of choices from millions to 3. And the answerers who were going to pick red, blue, or green anyway won't even notice the difference. And still others will prefer request 2 over request 1 because too much freedom can be a daunting thing. It forces your imagination to work hard. In my amusement park days, I sometimes worked in the candy store in front of a big display of 60 flavors of old-fashioned stick candy. 100 times a day, people would come in and ask, "What flavors do you have back there?" At first, I thought I would be a smart aleck and recite all 60 flavors. As I did this, the customers' eyes would get wide with fear, and right around the 32nd flavor, they would say, "Stop, stop, that's enough." They were completely overwhelmed by so many choices. After a while, I thought of a new approach. When they asked about the flavors, I would say, "We have every flavor you can imagine. Go on, name the flavors you like. I'm sure we have them." At first, they would be impressed with this powerful freedom, but then they would furrow up their brows, think hard, and say, cherry? No, wait, I don't want that. Peppermint? No, no, just forget it." And they would walk away in frustration. Finally, I figured out a strategy that sold a lot of candy sticks. When someone would ask about the flavors, I would say, "We have just about every flavor you can imagine, but our most popular flavors are cherry, blueberry, lemon, root beer, wintergreen, and licorice." They were delighted at having the feeling of freedom, but also glad to have a small number of attractive choices. In fact, most customers would choose from the popular 6, a list I made up and a list I would change frequently to help ensure the other flavors didn't get too old on the shelf. This is an example of indirect control in action. By constraining their choices, I made it more likely they would make a choice. But not just any choice, the choices I guided them towards. And despite my tricky methods of constraining their choices, they retained a feeling of freedom and perhaps felt an enhanced feeling of freedom, since their choices were clearer than when I didn't guide them at all. This method of indirect control by constraint is used in games all the time. If a game puts a player in an empty room with 2 doors, the player will almost certainly go through one of them. Which one, we don't necessarily know, but they will surely go through one, since a door is a message that says, "Open me," and players are naturally curious. After all, there is nowhere else to go. If you ask the player if they had choices, they would say they did, for even 2 options is a choice. Compare this to putting a player in an open field, out on a city street, or in a shopping mall. In those cases, where they go and what they do is far more open-ended and difficult to predict, unless you use other methods of indirect control. Indirect control method number 2, goals. The most common and straightforward use of indirect control in game design is through goals. If a player has 2 doors they can go through, I don't really know which one they are going to enter, but if I give them a goal of go find all the bananas and one of the doors clearly has bananas behind it, I can make a pretty good guess about where they're going to go. Earlier, we talked about the importance of establishing good goals to give players a reason to care about your game. Once clear and achievable goals have been established, though, you can take advantage of that fact by sculpting your world around the goals, since your players will only go places and do things they think will help fulfill the goals. If your driving game is about racing through a city to get to a finish line, you don't have to build a complete street map, because if you clearly mark the fastest route, people will mostly stick to that. You might add a small number of side streets, especially if some are shortcuts, to give a feeling of freedom, but the goal you have selected will indirectly control the players to avoid exploring every little side street. Creating content that players will never see does not give them more freedom. It just wastes development resources that could be used to improve the places that the players will see. Something important to note is the important interaction between player confidence and goals. If players feel very confident about their goals and their ability to pursue them, the powerful effects of indirect control will be multiplied, as the players will confidently follow their instincts. However, if players are confused about their goals or doubtful of their ability to interact properly in this world, the effects of indirect control will be greatly diminished, as the players second-guess their own instincts about what to do and how to do it. One fascinating real-world example of indirect control in action can be seen in the men's restrooms of Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport. Users of the urinals in these restrooms quickly noticed that they contain a fly. This is not an actual fly, rather, it is just an etching in the surface of the porcelain. Why? The designers were trying to solve the problem of sloppy marksmanship, which results in the need for more janitorial service. The etched fly creates an implicit goal: hit the fly. By placing the fly in the center of the urinal and slightly to one side to soften the angle of incidence, the bathrooms stay cleaner. The players have not had their freedom diminished in the least, but they are indirectly controlled toward the behavior that the designers find optimal. Indirect control method number 3. Interface. We've already talked about feedback, transparency, juiciness, and important aspects of a good interface, but there is something else to consider about your interface: indirect control. Because players want interfaces to be transparent, they don't really think about the interface, if they can help it. In other words, they set up their expectations about what they can and cannot do in a game based on the interface. If your Rockstar game has a plastic guitar as a physical interface, your players are probably going to expect to play the guitar, and it probably will not occur to them that they might want to do something else. If you give them a gamepad instead, they might wonder if they can play different instruments and do stage dives, or any number of those things, other things, a Rockstar might do. But that plastic guitar secretly steals away those options, silently limiting the players to a single activity. When we built our virtual pirates attraction with a wooden ship's wheel and 30-pound spun aluminum cannons, no guest ever asked whether they could sword fight as part of the game. That option never entered their minds. And it isn't just the physical interface that has its power. The virtual interface has it too. Even the avatar you control, which is part of the virtual interface, exerts indirect control over the player. If the player controls a human adventurer, they will try to do certain things. If they control a dragonfly, an elephant, or a Sherman tank, they will try to do very different things. The choice of avatar is partly about who a player will relate to, but it is also about implicitly limiting the player's options. Indirect control method number 4. Visual design. We are led to believe a lie when we see with, not through, the eye. Anyone who works in an area of the visual arts knows that the layout affects where the guests will look. This becomes very important in an interactive experience, since guests tend to go to what draws their attention. Therefore, if you can control where someone is going to look, you can control where they're going to. Figure 18.3 shows a simple example. It is difficult, looking at this picture, for your eyes not to be led to the center of the page. A guest looking at this scene in an interactive experience would be very likely to examine the central triangle before considering what might be at the edges of the frame. This is in sharp contrast to figure 18.4. Here, the guest's eyes are compelled to explore the edges of the frame and beyond. If this scene were part of an interactive experience, it would be a good bet that the guest would be trying to find out more about the objects on the edges rather than the circle in the middle of the scene. Most likely, they would try to push past the borders of the screen if they could. These examples are abstract, but there are plenty of real-world examples that illustrate the same thing. The designers of quilts, for example, think a great deal about how to draw the eye. It is often said that a good quilt design makes the eye flit continuously around the quilt, never letting it come to rest on a single image. Set designers, illustrators, architects, and cinematographers use these principles to guide the eye of their guests and indirectly control their focus. One excellent example is the castle at the center of Disneyland. Walt Disney knew that there was some risk of guests entering the park and milling about at the entrance, unsure of where to go. The castle is placed such that the guests' eyes are immediately drawn to it upon entering the park, similar to figure 18.3, and their feet are quick to follow. Soon the guests are at the Disneyland hub, with several visual landmarks beckoning them in differing directions, similar to figure 18.4. Indirectly, Walt was able to control guests to do just what he wanted them to do: move quickly to the center of Disneyland and then branch out randomly to other parts of the park. Of course, the guests are seldom aware of this manipulation. After all, no one told them where to go. All the guests know is that without much thinking and with total freedom, they ended up somewhere interesting and had a fun entertainment experience. Walt even had a name for this kind of manipulation. He called it a visual weenie, a reference to the way dogs are sometimes controlled on a movie set. A trainer holds a hot dog or piece of meat in the air and moves it around to control where the dog will look, since nothing draws the attention of a dog better than food. One of the keys to good level design is that the player's eyes pull them through the level effortlessly. It makes the player feel in control and immersed in the world. Understanding what pulls the eye of the player can give you tremendous power over the choices players want to make. When the Disney VR Studio worked on the Mark II version of Aladdin's Magic Carpet Ride VR Adventure, we faced a significant conundrum. One very important scene was the Palace Throne Room, as shown here. The animation director wanted players to fly into this room, then fly up to that little throne at the base of the elephant statue, and sit for a moment and listen to a message from the Sultan before they continued their gameplay. We had hoped the little Sultan, dressed in white, hopping up and down on that throne, would be enough to draw people over to listen to him, but that didn't happen. These players were on flying carpets. They wanted to fly all around, up to the ceiling, around the pillars, anywhere they could. Their implicit goal was to fly and have fun. Visiting the Sultan didn't fit in with that plan. And seeing no other choice, we were all set to implement a system that seized control from the players, dragging them across the room to the Sultan and gluing them to the spot while he talked. No one liked this idea, since we all knew it meant robbing the players of their precious feeling of freedom. But then the art director had an idea. He painted a single red line on the floor like this. His thinking was that maybe guests would follow the red line. We were all somewhat skeptical, but it was an easy thing for us to prototype. And to our stunned amazement, guests did exactly that. Upon entering the room, instead of flying every which way like we had seen before, they followed the red line like it was some kind of tractor beam, right up to the Sultan's throne. And when he started talking, by that time guests were right up close to him, they waited to hear what he had to say. It didn't work every single time, but it did work over 90% of the time, which was perfectly adequate for the experience. The most startling part was in the interviews afterwards. Upon asking players why they followed the red line in the throne room, they would say, "What red line?" It didn't register to them in their conscious memory at all. At first, this didn't make sense to me. How could a simple red line wipe the idea of flying around the room out of the minds of players? But then I realized it was seeing the columns and the chandeliers that put the idea of flying around into their minds. The red line was so visually dominant in the scene that it stopped them from noticing these other things, and so the idea to do these other things didn't even occur to them. Curiously, we faced a newer version of this problem in the Mark III version of the game. In this version, which was for 4 simultaneous players, we didn't want them all to go to the Sultan. We wanted them to split up and go to different places. We wanted some players to visit the Sultan and others to fly through doors on the left and right sides of the room. But the tyrannical red line was making all 4 players fly up to the Sultan. Again, we started discussing how we probably had to force the players to split up. But then we had a different thought. Could we change the red line to make that happen? We tried this, and it worked beautifully. For those who don't see the red line splits into 3. And it worked beautifully. In most cases, 2 players would visit the throne, 1 player would branch left, following the line to the left door, and 1 player would branch right, following the line to the right door. Indirect control method number 5. Characters. One very straightforward method of indirect controlling a player is through computer-controlled characters in the game. If you can use your storytelling ability to make the player actually care about the characters, that is, willingly wanting to obey them, protect them, help them, or destroy them, you suddenly have an excellent tool to control what the player will and will not try and do. This was used to great effect in an early interactive movie, Mr. Sardonicus, directed by William Castle in 1961, featured an unusual gimmick. The narrator explains that how the film ends is up to the audience, should the villain suffer punishment or be forgiven. Each audience member was given a thumbs up, thumbs down card to hold up so the projectionist could load the appropriate film reel. Castle had significant confidence that audiences would choose the punishment reel. He was so confident, in fact, that he never bothered to film the forgiveness reel, and no audience ever noticed. In the game Animal Crossing, a mysterious council called the Happy Room Academy, HRA, periodically evaluates how well you have decorated the interior of your house and awards you points based on how well you have done. Players work very hard to get these points, partly because it is a goal of the game, but I think also partly because it feels embarrassing to think that someone is looking at the inside of your house and shaking their head in disgust, even if they are only imaginary. In the game Ico, your goal is to protect a princess who travels with you. The designers have a very clever timer mechanism in the game. Evil spirits appear if you stay still too long, grab the princess, and try to drag her into a hole in the ground. Even though they can't hurt her unless they succeed in carrying her away, and it takes some time for them to actually pull her into the hole, I found myself snapping into action the moment they appeared, for the very idea of them touching her made me feel like I was letting her down. Characters can be a great way to manipulate the choices the player is trying to make, or how they feel about those choices. But first, you have to make the player care about how those imaginary characters feel. For once you have done that, it is easy to inspire action in the player, for one marvelous aspect of human nature is a deep desire to help those we empathize with. It is a point of view so useful we should add it to our toolbox. Number 80, the lens of help. Deep down, everyone wants to be helpful. To channel this helpful spirit toward engaging gameplay, ask yourself these questions. Within the context of the game, who is the player helping? Can I make the player feel more connected to the characters who need help? Can I better tell the story of how meeting game goals helps someone? How can the helped characters show their appreciation? Indirect control method number 6, music. When most designers think of adding music to a game, they usually think of the mood they want to create and the atmosphere of the game. But music can also have a significant effect on what players do. Restaurants use this method all the time. Fast music makes people eat faster, so during a lunch rush, many restaurants play high-energy dance music because faster eating means more profits. And of course, during a slow period, like 3 in the afternoon, they do the opposite. An empty restaurant often is a sign of a bad restaurant, so to make diners linger, they play slow music, which slows down the eating and makes customers consider ordering an extra cup of coffee or a dessert. Of course, the patrons don't realize this is happening. They think they have total freedom over their actions. If it works for restaurant managers, it can work for you. Think about what kind of music you should play to make players look around for something hidden, destroy everything possible without slowing down, realize they are heading the wrong way, move slowly and carefully, worry about accidentally hurting innocent bystanders, or go as far and as fast as possible without looking back. Music is the language of the soul, and as such, it speaks to players on a deep level. A level so deep that it can change their moods, desires, and actions, and they don't even realize it is happening. These 6 methods of indirect control can be very powerful ways to balance freedom and good storytelling. That it is possible your design is exerting control on players in ways you never intended is a note of caution, though. I took a friend to Walt Disney World's scary alien encounter experience back in the 1990s. It has since been made less frightening and more family-friendly. It consisted of indoor circular amphitheater with strange chairs that could create the illusion that a vicious alien monster was loose in the dark theater, brushing against you and breathing down your neck. It was so unique and exciting, I felt sure my friend would enjoy it, but when it was over, he seemed nonplussed. I asked what he thought, and he said it was okay, but when I saw how it was laid out in a circle and they strapped us into the chairs, I was sure that the theater would spin. But we just sat there. I mean, it was okay, just not what I expected. To make sure your experience has the right kind of indirect control, use this lens. Number 81. The lens of indirect control. Every designer has a vision of what they would like the players to do to have an ideal play experience. To help ensure the players do these things of their own free will, ask yourself these questions. Ideally, what would I like the players to do? Can constraints get players to do it? Can goals get players to do it? Can interface get players to do it? Can visual design get players to do it? Can game characters get players to do it? Can music or sound get players to do it? Is there some other method I can use to coerce players toward ideal behavior without impinging on their feeling of freedom? Is my design inducing desires I'd rather the player not have? Collusion. While designing Pirates of the Caribbean Battle for the Buccaneer Gold, we faced a significant challenge. We had to create a very powerful interactive experience that would only last 5 minutes. The interest curve had to be excellent, since a family of 4 could be paying as much as $20 just to play this game one time. But at the same time, we knew this couldn't be just a linear experience, because the very essence of being a pirate involved a feeling of tremendous freedom. Based on our previous experiences, we knew that this was a great opportunity for some indirect control. Our early prototypes of the game made one thing clear. If we just set people out on the ocean to battle enemies, they had great fun for about 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Then their zeal would wane, and they would sometimes ask, "So, is this all we do?" Clearly, this was an unacceptable interest curve. Players wanted more build-up. We thought a way to achieve this would be with some more interesting scenarios. We thought that by putting these scenarios near islands that the players could approach, it would be a great way to guide them to where interesting things were happening, kind of like the castle guides people in Disneyland. So we drew up an initial map. Players would start in the center, where we expected they would fight some enemies, and then they would hopefully sail for one of the islands, each designed to be interesting and visible from a distance. Which island they went to was up to them. They had freedom to choose, for each island had different types of encounters. At one, evil pirates were besieging a burning town. At another, a surprising mining operation was taking place on the side of a volcano. At a third, the Royal Navy was transporting huge quantities of gold and guarding their stronghold with catapults that launched fireballs. We were sure that these big islands would draw a lot of player interest. Boy, were we wrong. Taking a look at figure 18.9, you can see the problem. The players have been told that their goal is to sink the pirate ships. Here they are, surrounded by large, threatening pirate ships with bright white sails. Look at that poor volcano in the distance. It is hardly noticeable and has nothing to do with the player goals. We saw right away that this wasn't working, and we started considering the possibility of putting the pirate ship on a fixed path that guided them to the islands, but then we had a funny idea. What if the enemy pirate ships didn't act in their own best interest? Up until now, we had been spending a lot of time writing fancy algorithms to make the enemy ships attack with interesting and intelligent strategies. Our new idea was to scrap all that and change the logic of the ships. With the new system at the start of the game, when the players encounter ships on the open ocean, the ships would attack the players, but then they would start to flee. The players, fixed on their goal of destroying enemy ships, would pursue them. We then tried to time things so that right about when the players destroyed the enemy ships, the ships had arrived at one of the islands, chosen randomly. With the ships sunk, the players would look up to find themselves at an interesting island scenario. They would do battle there, only to be attacked by new ships that again fled. To where? To whatever island the players had not visited yet. This strategy worked magnificently. With a feeling of total freedom, the players would have a very structured experience. They would start with an exciting battle, followed by a mini scenario, followed by a new naval battle, followed by another new mini scenario. We knew we had to have a big finish, but we couldn't be sure where the players would be. So, a little bit after the 4th minute, the big finish came to them in the form of sudden fog and an attack by ghost pirates who engaged the players in an epic final battle. The whole thing was only possible because we did something very unusual. We made the characters in the game have two simultaneous goals. On one hand, their goal is to engage the players in a challenging battle. On the other hand, their goal is to lead the players to interesting places to keep the flow of the experience optimal. I call this principle collusion, since the game characters are colluding with the designer to make an experience that will be optimal for the players. It is an interesting form of indirect control that joins the methods of using goals, characters, and visual design for a single unified effect. There is some evidence that this kind of indirect control via collusion may be central to the future of interactive storytelling. The fascinating Facade experience, created by Andrew Stern and Michael Mateus, takes this idea to a new level. In Facade, you get to play the role of a guest at a dinner party, hosted by Grace and Trip, a married couple. Your interface is one that mainly consists of speaking through typed text, which offers tremendous freedom and flexibility. As you play, you quickly notice that you are the only guest at the party, and weirdly, it is their anniversary. The situation is very uncomfortable because of their constant bickering, each trying to get you to take sides in their argument. It is a very unusual game experience, with goals that are more like those in a novel or television show than in a video game. Something else is unusual too. The game seems to play quite differently on different sessions. Each time you play, you hear perhaps 10% of the dialogue that was recorded. This is not a string of pearls structure, or even a branching structure. This is a simulation where Grace and Trip are artificially intelligent characters who have goals that they are trying to achieve. This is done through fairly standard AI models of goals related to behaviors that are triggered by sensors, figure 18.11. However, like our tricky pirate ships, Grace and Trip are not just trying to satisfy their own goals. They are also very aware that they are part of a story and, as such, should be trying to make it interesting. As they make their choices about what to say and do, part of their decision concerns whether what they are saying is of the proper tension for this part of the story, and the designers encoded a timeline of what they thought was an appropriate tension over time for the experience, figure 18.12. Does that graph look familiar? By having Grace and Trip make decisions that follow this tension graph, while simultaneously trying to fulfill the goals that they have as characters in the story, their behavior makes sense while keeping the player interested in the sequence of events. It would seem that we have only scratched the surface of the type of experiences that might be possible through the clever use of collusion. If you'd like to consider how you might use it in your game, use this lens. Lens number 82, the lens of collusion. Characters should fulfill their roles in the game world, but, when possible, also serve as the many minions of the game designer, working toward the designer's ultimate aim, which is to ensure an engaging experience for the player. To make sure your character are living up to this responsibility, ask yourself these questions. What do I want the player to experience? How can the characters help fulfill the experience without compromising their goals in the game world? The Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu wrote, "When the best leader's work is done, the people say, 'We did it ourselves.'" Hopefully, you will find the subtle techniques of indirect control useful when trying to lead your players to engaging experiences where they will feel control, mastery, and success. But where is it that these engaging experiences will take place? Other reading to consider. Picture This: How Pictures Work by Molly Bang. This simple guide by a noted illustrator of children's books is the best guide to visual indirect control I have ever found.